That night was the first time Graham Beckett truly saw his housekeeper, with a faint streak of flour on her cheek and a clear shimmer of fear in her eyes. She believed he was about to dismiss her, while he wondered if perhaps he was about to thank someone for the first time in many long years. The penthouse was nearly silent, and below them the city of Chicago lay drenched in streetlights as the sparse late-night traffic drifted along Michigan Avenue. Inside, the only light came from the kitchen at the end of the hallway, warm and softly golden, standing out against the cold steel and polished glass that formed the rest of his world. Graham had grown accustomed to quiet so complete it seemed every sound was swallowed by a luxurious vacuum, but tonight, as he stepped in from the long corridor, he sensed something entirely different. The scent of tomato sauce simmering gently, laced with oregano, basil, and a hint of freshly ground black pepper. It was not the smell of packaged dinners or the industrial kitchen meals his assistant usually arranged. It was the smell of something alive, something made by a person who was truly here. He moved quietly past the living area, his leather shoes barely making a sound on the dark wooden floor. The 42nd floor apartment was familiar, yet tonight it felt strangely changed. She was standing there, Claire Bennett, her back turned to him, her lightly curled hair tied up hastily with an old elastic band, her cream apron stained with a few spots of red sauce, one hand holding a wooden spoon and the other lifting the lid of the pot. She was murmuring softly to herself, her voice gentle as a lullaby, as if she were speaking to the pot. He had never seen anyone do that in this kitchen, not here, not in his world. She turned when he spoke, freezing like a startled deer caught in the glare of headlights. On her left cheek the streak of flour remained, and her eyes widened with surprise, mixed with panic and a touch of embarrassment. She apologized quickly, saying she thought he would be home later, that she was simply preparing the meal she usually left on the table, explaining that her younger sister had sent some organic tomatoes from their hometown, and she wanted to use them before they spoiled. Her voice sped up, her eyes avoiding his, her hands fumbling as she placed the lid back on the pot. Graham said nothing for a few seconds, not from anger, but because he could not quite name the feeling rising within him. How long had it been since someone truly lived in this home, not merely passing through, not coming in to finish a task and leave, but existing here, present, a real human presence? His housekeeper, whose name he had barely remembered until this moment, suddenly became a person with shape and warmth, no longer the quiet shadow walking through the rigid schedule and numbed routines of his life. Claire. He recalled his assistant mentioning that name once. Claire had been hired through a reputable service, her background spotless, her temperament calm, never complaining, never causing trouble, never attracting attention. Yet now she stood before him with flour on her cheek and worry in her eyes, and he found himself unable to look away. He stepped closer and glanced at the pot gently bubbling, the steam carrying a scent that stirred a surprising hunger in him, one that his cold, impersonal meals had long silenced. He asked her what she was cooking, his voice deep as usual but lacking its usual sharpness. Claire looked up, startled, and answered that it was pasta with a sauce her grandmother used to make, adding softly that it probably would not suit his taste. Graham looked at her for a few more seconds before slowly pulling out a nearby chair and sitting down, saying he would eat right there. Claire stood still, unsure of what she was witnessing. She had never seen her employer stay for dinner, much less in this way. In truth, she had never seen him look at her, as if she were an actual person. And for the first time, standing in the warm kitchen with the cold city shimmering beyond the glass, Claire felt that she was no longer invisible. If you have stayed with us until this moment, thank you for giving your time to this small story. If you have ever believed that gentle things were not meant for you, then perhaps you understand the feeling Claire has just faced. We have many more stories like this, warm and honest and quiet enough to reach the heart of anyone who listens. Please subscribe to the channel, like, and share the video if you would like to walk with us each day. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment below so we can know where this story has found you, whether you are in Chicago, Saigon, San Jose, or any small corner of the world. Thank you for being here. And Claire's journey is far from over, so we invite you to continue with us. Claire stood awkwardly by the stove, her hands twisting a small towel and releasing it again, unsure what to do, while Graham remained seated at the table, his eyes fixed on the pot, sending up soft clouds of steam. The silence between them was not tense. It was the delicate kind of silence that feels like a newly opened sheet of paper, waiting for someone to decide what should be written next. She had never sat down for a meal with her employer, not because of any rule, but because the idea itself had always been impossible. In his world, she had been invisible until tonight. Graham did not command anything of her, and he made no request. He simply sat there, resting his elbows on the table, his gaze gentler than usual. When he asked if she could sit down, Claire startled so sharply that the towel slipped from her hand and fell to the floor without her even noticing. She stammered that she had meant only to leave his meal on the table as she did every evening, and he told her this evening was not like every other. His voice was steady, neither hard nor soft, but something in his eyes made it impossible for her to refuse. Claire nodded, set the spoon aside, washed her hands quickly, and gingerly pulled out the chair across from him. The meal began in a tender kind of clumsiness. Graham tasted a bite in silence, then furrowed his brows just slightly, enough to send a flash of worry through her. She rushed to ask if something was wrong, saying she knew she should have let the sauce simmer another 10 minutes. But he had come home earlier than she expected. He set his fork down and told her no, that it was good, truly good, unlike anything he had ever eaten in this home. Claire looked surprised. Then she smiled, the first smile he had seen from her since entering the kitchen. It was not a perfect smile. It tilted a little, carrying a hint of shyness, but it was real. She told him it was her grandmother's recipe, explaining that her grandmother used to say good food needed both hands and a heart to make it, and she had always assumed her grandmother said that merely to make her feel special, but perhaps her grandmother had been right. Graham said nothing more and simply continued eating, every movement deliberate, as if what he tasted was not merely food, but a fragment of memory. Claire sat across from him, not daring to take her first bite right away, feeling as though she were dreaming. The kitchen was still the same kitchen, the same soft golden light, yet the air felt completely different. She was no longer someone serving a meal, she was someone invited to sit. They ate in quiet that was not uncomfortable, and every faint clink of the spoon, every pause to pour water sounded like a gentle piece of wordless music. Midway through the meal, Graham asked softly how long she had been working there, and Claire needed a few seconds to recall that it had been more than 7 months, working part-time for the service company during the evening shift, mainly cleaning the kitchen and preparing food. He nodded and asked why he did not remember ever seeing her, and Claire let out a small laugh, saying perhaps it was because she came and went when he was not home, or because she simply was not someone worth noticing. Graham lifted his eyes. He told her she was wrong. Only 3 words. Yet they tightened her throat until she could barely swallow. She tried to smile, though her eyes glistened. She said she was fine, that she was used to working in silence, used to being unnoticed because people who are never seen cannot be hurt. Graham set his plate down and looked at her for a long moment before telling her that people who are unseen also cannot be truly looked at. Claire did not lift her head, yet her heart pounded as if his words had cast a light into a quiet corner she had kept hidden. When they finished eating, she rose automatically to clear the table, but he told her gently to leave it, that it could be done the next day. She stared at him, asking if he meant it. And he said yes, that the evening was enough, and she should go rest. Claire glanced around the kitchen, her fingers brushing the edge of her apron without thinking, and she thanked him for letting her sit. Graham answered by letting his eyes rest for a moment on her cheek, where the dried flower still lingered, and he thanked her for cooking the best meal he had ever eaten in that home. When Claire stepped out the door, her footsteps felt lighter than they ever had, and she could not understand why her heart was still beating so fast. And Graham, sitting alone in the soft golden light of the kitchen, thought again and again about the scent of the tomato sauce and the woman with the crooked smile who had just left his apartment. One dinner, one chair, one shared glance, and perhaps everything had just begun to change. The next morning, when Claire stepped into the apartment as she did every day, carrying a bag of fresh vegetables and a few sprigs of basil wrapped in a paper towel, she expected nothing out of the ordinary. She had convinced herself that the previous night had been only a passing moment, a brief shift in the well-oiled machinery of a man no one dared to approach. But as soon as she entered the kitchen, she froze. On the marble counter were 2 cups of coffee, one still sending up a thin ribbon of steam, and Graham was standing by the sink without a suit jacket, only a white dress shirt and light gray trousers, holding a file and glancing toward her at the sound of the door. He told her her coffee was waiting, saying he guessed she preferred a medium roast without sugar. Claire stopped short, stunned, asking how he knew what she liked. And he set the file down with a slight lift of his shoulders as if he were doing the most ordinary thing in the world, saying he did not know but had guessed, and that if he was wrong, he would drink it for her. Claire approached, lifted the cup, and tasted a sip. It was exactly right. The flavor, the temperature, and she smiled more naturally this time, thanking him. They stood there for a few seconds in the early sunlight filtering through the blinds, Graham keeping his distance but without the familiar coldness, and then he asked, as though remembering suddenly whether the grandmother she had mentioned the night before was the one who had taught her to cook. Claire nodded, her gaze softening as if she were looking through a doorway into an older time, saying her grandmother was the only person who ever made her feel she did not have to become someone else, that when she cooked with her, she could simply be herself, rounder, clumsier, even pouring too much salt by mistake, and her grandmother would only laugh and say that was what gave her food, its soul. Graham listened intently. Claire rarely spoke this much, yet now her words flowed gently like warm water. She told him she had once attended a culinary school, beginning with enthusiasm and believing she had found her path, until she realized that in a professional kitchen, no one cared about emotion, only speed, efficiency, and knives sharper than words, and she was not made for that world, not compact enough to fit into its hard edges. She paused, took another sip of coffee, and told him how one day the head chef called her forward in front of everyone and asked who would ever want to eat a dish made by someone who could not even control her own body. Graham's hand tightened around the rim of his cup, his eyes darkening, though Claire, looking down at the kitchen floor, did not see it. She told him she dropped out that very day, went home for a few months, then returned to the city, thinking she might abandon cooking altogether, until one evening she walked through a park in the rain and saw a homeless man shivering, and she bought him a serving of hot soup. And when he tasted it, he told her it had been a long time since he felt a flavor that made him believe someone truly cared. In that moment, she knew she could never stop cooking. Even if she never worked in a restaurant, she would cook for someone, even just one person, as long as they needed it. Graham stood silent. Claire looked back at him with a small smile, explaining that this was why she chose evening shifts in quiet places where she could cook without pressure, and that every meal she left on his table had a bit of hand-ground oregano, the spice her grandmother called affection crushed into tiny pieces. She admitted it sounded silly, but insisted she believed it was real. Graham set his cup down and stepped one pace toward her, not too close, telling her it was not silly at all. Claire smiled again, a full and open smile this time, and in that moment the kitchen seemed to brighten, not only with sunlight, but with something delicate they had just shared. And for the first time in many years, Graham did not feel alone in his own home. After that morning, Graham began noticing things he had never paid attention to before, not because he tried to, but because his mind kept returning on its own to the moments when Claire spoke about her grandmother, about the bowl of soup in the park, about the seasoning she called affection crushed into tiny pieces. In the evenings, when he returned home, the apartment was still as quiet as ever. Yet now he felt the absence of something, not the lack of sound, but the absence of a presence. Each time he stepped into the kitchen, if he saw the light on or heard the gentle tap of a spoon against a pot, he slowed his steps, not in avoidance and not in haste, simply choosing to remain a little longer. Claire noticed the change as well. Before, all she ever heard was the door closing and his footsteps disappearing into the office down the hall. Some nights he did not come home at all, and when he did, he only passed through quickly, never allowing his gaze to rest on where she stood. But now he often paused at the kitchen doorway and asked simple questions such as whether the weather had been cold that day or what smelled so good, and he lingered just a bit longer than necessary. Once, he watched her peeling apples and unexpectedly asked whether she always peeled them in that long spiral. Claire startled slightly and smiled, saying she did because her grandmother claimed that if the peel never broke, the wish would come true. Graham did not respond, but she saw his eyes resting for a long moment on the motion of her hands. On another evening, after she forgot a small handkerchief beside the stove, she returned the next morning to find it neatly folded on top of the tea box with a handwritten note saying he believed it belonged to her. Claire recognized the firm handwriting, slanted slightly to the right, as if the person who wrote it was far more accustomed to signing contracts than leaving small messages, and she slipped the note into her apron pocket without a word, unable to stop herself from smiling all day. Graham found himself unsettled by his own behavior. He had never been someone easily moved by anyone's presence. His world was built on decisions, numbers, and strategies that left no room for vague emotions. Yet whenever Claire passed by with a basket of vegetables in her arms and her hair a little tousled from the hallway breeze, he paused without meaning to. Not because she was striking in any conventional way, but because something about her felt unmistakably real, a kind of life that was neither controlled, nor scheduled, nor forced into shape. And the more time passed, the more he realized that the silence between them was no longer a gap. It felt instead like a bridge where they stood at opposite ends, saying nothing yet, looking toward the same middle point. One night, Graham came home late while a light rain fell outside. Claire was still in the kitchen wiping down the counters, wearing a thick earth-brown cardigan with the sleeves pushed up so they would not get wet. Graham entered with raindrops still clinging to his coat, and Claire looked up with a small smile, telling him he was home late. He nodded and brushed a hand through his damp hair before asking why she had not left yet. And she said she wanted to finish cleaning the kitchen because the next morning would be cold, and she did not want the floor to be slippery when he woke early. Graham watched her quietly for a moment, 1 second, then 2, before asking whether anyone had ever cooked for her. Claire blinked, unsure she had heard correctly, and he clarified that he meant whether anyone had ever prepared a meal for her simply because they wanted her to feel cared for. Claire lowered her gaze and wiped another small spot on the counter, saying not many, but it was all right, because she was used to taking care of herself. Graham nodded and left the kitchen, yet he did not go straight to his room that night. He stopped in the hallway and looked through the narrow opening of the kitchen door, watching her fold the cleaning cloth, place it neatly in the drawer, and then release a soft, tired breath as though she were letting go of something heavy inside her. and Graham understood then that he had begun to see far more than what his eyes alone had ever shown him. The next day, when Claire entered the apartment as she usually did, the space was quiet as always, but something felt different. She did not hear the coffee machine humming the way it had the past few mornings, nor did she see the kitchen light glowing softly the way it usually was. Everything was dark and still, as if the apartment itself had overslept. She called out softly, and no one answered. She was about to step into the kitchen when she noticed something placed on the surface of the bar, an envelope without a name, made of thick cream paper, the corner slightly creased as though it had passed through several hands. Curious, Claire walked closer. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, the words printed neatly by machine with no heading and no signature, only a few short lines. It asked her what she thought she was doing, told her she did not belong in that place, and warned her to step away before someone made her do so. Claire froze. Her heart pounded as if she had just sprinted up 10 flights of stairs. She read the lines again, but they cut just as sharply, cold and blunt and full of warning. She lifted her gaze and looked around, the apartment still silent, yet for the first time she felt unsafe. Who had gotten inside? Who knew her name? Who knew she was here? And more importantly, why send a threat? She stuffed the paper back into the envelope and was about to leave the kitchen when Graham walked in. His eyes stopped immediately on her pale face. He asked what was wrong. Claire shook her head, hiding the envelope behind her back and insisting it was nothing, that she was only tired. Graham looked at her for another moment, then his gaze dropped to her hand. When he asked what she was holding, Claire hesitated and said it was only a piece of paper someone must have left behind and that it was not important. He told her to give it to him, his voice not raised but carrying the quiet pressure of someone accustomed to managing every situation. Claire hesitated, then slowly handed him the envelope. Graham opened it, his eyes scanning the message once before folding the paper neatly and slipping it into the pocket of his coat. He turned away without speaking. Claire tried to brush it aside, telling him someone was probably just playing a joke, perhaps an unpleasant former employee, and that it was nothing serious. Graham cut her off, saying it was not a joke, but a warning. Claire fell silent. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before, a coldness not directed at her, but the cold calculation of a man assessing, analyzing, and protecting. Graham lifted his phone, motioned for her to wait, and made a series of quick, low commands, instructing someone to change the passcodes, check the cameras, review the security staff, and pull the entry logs from the past 48 hours. When he hung up, his eyes never left Claire. He told her she would no longer go home alone, that he would arrange for someone to drive her, and for the time being she would not leave the apartment without an escort. She asked whether such measures were necessary, and he answered with one firm word, yes. Then he stepped closer. For the first time standing so near she could see the sharp glint of light in his eyes, like steel catching a reflection. He told her he did not know who had done this, but he knew one thing, that no one had the right to threaten her simply because she had stepped into his life. Claire felt her heart tighten. She could not tell whether what flooded her chest was fear or gratitude, perhaps both. But she understood one thing clearly. After today, nothing remained the same. No more accidental glances. No more quiet attentiveness. Something had awakened, and sometimes, in the most fragile moment, true feeling reveals itself not through words, but through the way a man steps between you and a world that has suddenly grown dangerous. Claire could not sleep at all that night. She lay on the bed in her small apartment on the 6th floor of an old building, the warm hallway light seeping through the narrow crack beneath the door and casting long shadows on the wall like quiet, watchful hands. The warning letter kept circling through her mind, repeating itself like a weary whisper she could not shut out. She had dealt with unpleasant people before, had heard whispered comments behind her back, had endured judgmental glances, but this was the first time she felt fear, real fear, not because of the threat itself, but because for the first time she sensed there was something precious she did not want to lose. The next morning, when she stepped into the lobby of Graham's elegant building, she saw two men in black suits standing at the entrance, earpieces in their ears. One of them nodded at her and opened the door. Claire walked in, slightly unsettled. Graham stood near the window with the morning light falling across his shoulder, making his dark brown hair appear as though it were brushed with a thin veil of mist. He turned the moment he saw her. He told her he had increased security and that she would no longer be coming and going alone, but he wanted to speak with her privately. Claire nodded and followed him down the left hallway, a place she had never been before. The last door opened to reveal a room completely unlike the rest of the apartment. Warm, wooden floors, soft lighting, and the faint scent of oak. A small guest bedroom but fully furnished. Graham gestured toward it and told her he wanted her to stay there temporarily until things became clearer. Claire stopped short, insisting it was unnecessary and that she was fine. Graham looked at her, not harsh and not commanding, but steady as stone, saying he was not fine with her going home alone every night, and not fine with someone possibly watching her, and that he would not stand still. Claire pressed her lips together and looked again at the room. Neat, private, and safe, far safer than anything in her world. She whispered that she did not want to trouble him, that she was only... And Graham interrupted gently but firmly, saying she did not trouble him and that he had ignored her presence for far too long, and that time was over. Claire lifted her eyes to him, and for a moment the fear inside her seemed to quiet, not disappear entirely, but pushed back by the sense that someone was truly on her side. She nodded softly and agreed, only temporarily. He smiled, a rare smile she had seen only a few times, and told her temporarily until he was certain she was safe. Claire stepped into the room and sat on the bed, her hand brushing over the beige blanket. Everything was soft and clean and peaceful, a world apart from her cold nights alone in the old apartment with the heater creaking like a never-ending whisper. Graham stood in the doorway, not entering but not leaving either, and told her the left closet already held a few basic items, and that she could ask him or Marcus if she needed anything, explaining that Marcus would be the one watching over her. Claire teased lightly, asking whether he had hired a private bodyguard for her, and he told her no. He had hired a bodyguard for the person who had made his dinners taste alive again for the first time in many years. Claire's cheeks warmed, but she said nothing. Graham watched her a moment longer, then nodded and told her to rest, that he would let her know when there was news. When the door closed behind him, Claire leaned back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. She did not know what the future held or who was behind the warning letter, but for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel alone. Someone had seen her, truly seen her, and that alone, even inside a small borrowed room, made the world outside feel a little less frightening. Claire woke earlier than usual in the unfamiliar room, the soft morning light slipping gently through the thin curtains and bathing everything in a pale, tender gold. She lay still for a moment, feeling the softness of the blanket, the pillow scented with expensive soap, and the almost complete absence of sound. Everything felt foreign, yet not entirely unwelcome. After a few hesitant minutes, she stood, pulled on a light cardigan, and stepped out of the room. As she walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, she heard faint clattering, smelled coffee drifting through the air, and saw something she never expected. Graham standing in the kitchen. No suit, no phone in his hand. Just a man with slightly tousled hair holding a pan in one hand while fumbling with a butter lid in the other. Claire stopped at the doorway. Graham turned, startled for a moment at the sight of her, then recovered his usual composure. He explained he had intended to make breakfast for both of them, but believed he had miscalculated the amount of butter. Claire stepped closer, looking into the pan where a few eggs had begun to cling to the bottom, and she smiled, gently taking the spatula from his hand and telling him she would handle it, reassuring him the pan could still be saved. She realized she had said the word she without thinking, but Graham seemed not to notice. He stepped back, folding his arms and leaning against the counter while watching each careful movement she made as she lowered the heat, loosened the eggs, and sprinkled a touch of black pepper. Claire asked him quietly what he usually ate for breakfast, and he replied coffee, sometimes a piece of toast if he had time, though he rarely ate with anyone. She told him then that today was an exception. She turned, placing 2 plates of eggs with a few slices of toast on the table, and Graham pulled out a chair, waiting for her to sit before taking his own seat. They began eating with few words, but the air was easy, not strained. Claire glanced at him more than once, noticing how deliberate he was with each bite, as if he were tasting something meaningful. She laughed softly and told him he did not need to eat as though he were judging a Michelin dish. Graham looked up, a brief smile flickering in his eyes, and said he was only trying to determine whether the flavor came from salvaged butter or a certain extraordinary set of hands. Claire tilted her head and told him it was the hands, and that the butter had been abused. They both laughed. Just a short laugh, but genuine. The first laughter the kitchen had heard in the morning since she arrived in that home. After the meal, Graham refilled her cup of coffee with a slightly clumsy motion, a bit spilling over the rim. He wiped it with a napkin, his movements awkward, and Claire watched him with an amused smile, asking whether he often did this. He told her he made coffee, yes, but not usually for someone else. Claire looked at him for a long moment before asking why he was doing all this, bringing her here, increasing security, making breakfast. Graham did not answer immediately. He turned the cup gently in his hands, watching the thin curl of steam rise from the surface, and finally said it was because he could not bear the thought of someone wanting to harm her, not in this space, not now that he had truly seen her. Claire felt her throat tighten, the words simple but reaching deeply into her, not because they were sweet, but because they were true, awkward, unfamiliar, but true. That breakfast was not luxurious. Only a few eggs, toast, coffee, and 2 people trying to learn how to care for each other in their own quiet ways. But for Claire, it was the first breakfast where she felt someone had placed her above convenience. And for Graham, it was the first breakfast where he felt this cold kitchen was finally inhabited by someone real, not merely a worker, but a woman he was learning to see with new eyes. After that breakfast, the air between them took on a gentle strangeness. Neither of them mentioned the room she had moved into, nor the threatening letter, yet every glance and every movement seemed wrapped in a thin layer of emotion, something shapeless and unspoken that made both of them quietly unsettled. Claire continued cooking as usual, but now, every time she turned to reach for the spices, she felt Graham's gaze following her. And she could not ignore the way he found reasons to linger in the kitchen longer than necessary, even if only to ask a passing question or to taste something she had just seasoned. One evening, while she was tossing a salad at the counter, Graham stepped behind her to reach for a bottle of balsamic vinegar on the shelf above her head. The moment was too quick for either of them to prepare. His hand brushed her shoulder and Claire froze, a small current running down her spine. She looked up to find his eyes just as startled as hers. They stepped back at almost the same time, as if both realized they had crossed an invisible line. Graham was the first to break the silence, apologizing and saying he had only meant to grab the bottle. Claire shook her head, her voice soft but not quite trembling as she told him she simply was not used to someone being that close. He nodded slightly, his gaze lingering on her face as he admitted he was not used to it either. The air thickened between them, filled with unspoken words that hung quietly in the space. Claire turned back to the salad, though her hands trembled slightly as she sliced the apple. Graham noticed. He set the bottle down and stepped back, saying nothing more, yet she knew he was trying not to make her feel pressured. That night, after finishing her cleaning, Claire returned to her room and found a message on her phone from an unknown number. Her heart tightened the moment she read the first line. It asked whether she had not yet learned to be afraid, whether one warning had not been enough, and told her she was foolish to think she would be left in peace simply because she had caught his attention. There was no signature, no identifying detail. Only a few cold sentences that froze her completely. She looked around the room, everything still neat and quiet, the bedside lamp casting a soft glow, yet the sense of safety she had begun to build evaporated at once. She held the phone and slowly walked out, her heartbeat thudding hard against her ribs. When she approached the living room, she found Graham on the sofa with a file in his hand, though his eyes were not reading a single line. Claire hesitated before telling him she had something to show him. Graham looked up instantly, and when she held out the phone, he read the message slowly, word by word, his mouth tightening. A moment later, he pulled out his own phone, called Marcus, and ordered a full sweep of every entry device, a review of hallway cameras, and access to the system needed to trace the anonymous message. His voice was not loud, but sharp as a blade. When he ended the call, he told her he did not want her frightened, but they needed to increase security again, that no one had the right to make her feel small. Claire sat on the edge of the sofa, still holding her phone, and told him that if the sender knew him, they might be using her to reach him. Graham did not answer. He had already considered that possibility, but he refused to say it aloud. He did not want Claire to think she was merely a vulnerability in the familiar game of power he had lived with for so many years. He wanted her to know she was someone he had chosen to protect, not a target to be exploited. He told her he would replace the entire security system and that she should not leave the apartment, even during the day, unless someone accompanied her, because this was no longer a warning but a declaration of intent. Claire looked into his eyes and saw not only anger, but a deep, steady worry. She nodded, for the first time not pretending to be strong. She leaned lightly against the back of the chair and looked out the window. The Chicago night still glowed with bright lights and busy streets. Yet for Claire, the world had changed. And while the danger loomed closer, the only thing keeping her from collapsing was the unwavering gaze of the man sitting beside her. The man she knew would not allow anyone to harm her ever again. The next morning, just as Claire finished pouring the coffee, Graham entered the kitchen with an ivory envelope in his hand, his expression calm, yet carrying something different in his eyes. As though he had already made a decision he himself was unsure how she would receive. He set the envelope on the counter between the two steaming cups of coffee and told her that he had to attend an annual fundraising gala hosted by the city's financial council that weekend, and wanted her to go with him. Claire froze mid-pour and looked up, surprise and a flicker of worry passing across her face. He nodded when she repeated the word her, telling her it was not as an employee but as his invited guest, as the person accompanying him. Claire bit her lip, her hand trembling slightly around the cup as she asked whether he was certain, reminding him the people attending belonged to a very different world, and she did not look anything like them. Graham stepped closer, his voice low and firm, telling her it was precisely because she was not like them that he wanted her there. She looked at the envelope, then up at him again, murmuring that people would stare and talk about her. He told her they had stared at him his whole life and spoken behind his back thousands of times, and he did not care about one more moment of that. But he did care if she felt unsafe or uncomfortable. Claire fell quiet. She understood this was not a casual invitation. It was a statement, a deliberate step across whatever boundaries had existed between them into something deeper and braver. She drew a slow breath and whispered she had nothing to wear. Graham reached into the pocket of his vest and handed her a small black card, explaining he had anticipated that, and that Marcus knew someone at a private design studio who would arrange everything, and all she needed was to choose what made her feel most like herself. Claire looked at the card and let out a soft laugh, asking if he was always this prepared, and he told her only when he wanted something to happen the right way. That afternoon, she was taken to a boutique on a quiet street where tall windows reflected the gentle late autumn sun. The staff did not look at her as though she did not belong. They addressed her by name, offering options tailored exactly to measurements she had never given anyone. After more than an hour of trying on outfits, Claire stepped out of the fitting room in a simple black dress that fit her body perfectly, the neckline subtly shaped, the sleeves draping off her shoulders, modest yet unmistakably feminine. She stood before the mirror, breathless. It had been so long since she had seen herself not as someone trying to hide her body, but as someone truly present, a woman who did not need to apologize for the shape she carried. That evening, when she stepped out of the bedroom wearing the dress, Graham was waiting in the living room. He turned, and his eyes lingered on her several seconds longer than usual. He spoke no compliment aloud, but Claire saw everything in his gaze, the recognition, the quiet astonishment, and something deeper still. When he asked if she felt all right, Claire said she had never seen herself look so different, yet she had never felt so confident. Graham held out his hand without another word, and for the first time she stepped toward him without hesitation. Her hand in his was warm, steady, and sure. On the way to the gala, neither of them spoke much. Only the soft sound of the car gliding through the illuminated streets. But the silence between them was nothing like the early days, not awkward and not guarded. It was a silence of anticipation, as though both of them already knew the evening ahead would not simply be an event, but a turning point, a moment after which nothing would remain the same. The grand lobby of the Rosemont Hotel glowed beneath sweeping crystal chandeliers suspended from the high ceiling, their warm golden light shimmering across evening gowns and expensive suits, moving gracefully through the elegant space. When Graham and Claire entered, several heads turned almost immediately, not because Graham Beckett was an unfamiliar figure in financial or media circles, but because the woman at his side was not one of the usual faces who accompanied him to annual social events. Claire walked slowly, every step measured, her hand resting within the bend of Graham's arm, her palm warm from his presence, and from a nervousness she could not hide. But Graham walked as if she had always belonged there. Not a hint of hesitation, no space left between them. Not someone trailing after him, but someone walking with him. They paused when a group of guests approached. An older man with silver hair neatly combed back, and a deep, commanding voice shook Graham's hand before turning his gaze to Claire. He remarked that Graham had surprised everyone by bringing a companion and asked who she was. Graham did not look to Claire but met the man's gaze directly, his voice steady as he introduced her as Claire Bennett, someone he valued and trusted. Claire startled slightly but regained her composure quickly, offering a gentle smile and nod. The man returned the greeting politely, though Claire caught the brief blink and flicker of doubt in his eyes. She knew what he was thinking. Everyone here was thinking the same. A woman with no pedigree, no reputation, no polished background worthy of this world. But Graham did not allow the silence to settle. He continued introducing her to others, one by one, not as a guest by convenience, but as if she were already an integral part of his presence. Claire realized that his calm was shielding her from every scrutinizing stare. By offering no explanation, he left no room for doubt. The evening carried on with soft jazz from the far corner of the room and trays of wine and canapes moving steadily through the crowd. Claire stood beside Graham for most of the time, but gradually she found herself speaking with a few guests who seemed more approachable. A middle-aged woman asked about her dress. A young journalist wondered if she worked in interior design. Claire smiled, neither denying nor confirming, keeping her answers vague enough to avoid intrusion, yet sincere enough not to seem like a performance. Graham watched her from a distance at one point as she listened to an older woman speak about a stray dog charity. Claire's face was not radiant in the way of high society women, but her eyes lit up each time someone said something amusing or unexpected. She did not try to fit in, and that made her stand out more than anyone in the room. After a brief speech from the event host, a slow song began to play, and Graham moved through the crowd to find her. He reached out his hand without a word. Claire held his gaze for a few seconds, then placed her hand in his and let him lead her to the dance floor. Under the dim light and soft music, they danced slowly, as if the world around them were only a blurred backdrop. Graham whispered that she was doing wonderfully. Claire smiled without looking up, telling him it was because she knew someone was standing beside her. He tightened his hold on her hand. In an evening filled with glamour and the subtle theater of power, Graham brought her into the light, not by declaration, but by taking her hand before every watching eye. And for the first time, Claire did not feel out of place. She stood exactly where she was meant to stand, beside the man who had chosen to truly see her in a world where people moved far too quickly past one another. The car slipped quietly away from the Rosemont Hotel, gliding through the brightly lit night streets of Chicago. Inside, Claire sat beside Graham, her hands resting in her lap, no longer held in his since they had stepped out of the ballroom. She said nothing, her eyes fixed on the window, her carefully applied makeup now softened beneath a veil of silence. Graham turned his head slightly, his gaze searching for some small sign that she was all right, that the stares and murmurs of the evening had not shaken her. But Claire did not look back. She bit her lip, the color nearly faded. She asked if he had heard what people said, her voice quiet yet clear enough to cut through the hush inside the car. Graham was silent for several seconds before admitting he had heard, but did not care. Claire let out a soft, tired breath of laughter and told him that was because he was Graham Beckett, untouchable, but she was not. Graham turned fully, his voice dropping lower as he told her she did not have to care about people who judged with nothing but prejudice, that she owed them nothing. Claire shook her head, still watching the blur of streetlights streak past the window, saying she was not upset with them but with herself, because hearing what they said had not made her angry, only aware that they were right. She told him she did not belong there, that she had no background, no model's figure to slip into a gown, no polished words, that she was only an ordinary woman with a past she barely dared reveal. Graham started to speak, but Claire turned to him with a hint of frustration in her eyes for the first time, telling him that when people asked if she was his personal assistant, she nearly nodded, because if she told the truth, that she was only a housekeeper he had invited, they would laugh in her face. And the worst part was that she feared she could not bear seeing him uncomfortable because of her. Graham paused, his expression tightening, and he asked whether she truly believed he would be ashamed. Claire did not answer, lowering her gaze instead. The air in the car grew heavier, no background music left, only the hum of the air system and the quiet press of their breathing. After a long moment, Graham spoke again, slowly and firmly, telling her he had not brought her there to fill space beside him, but because he wanted the world to know she existed in his life, and if she felt it had been a mistake, then he was the one at fault, not her. Claire closed her eyes and drew a long breath, telling him she did not blame him, only that she was not ready to be pulled into his light, because his light was too bright, and she was not yet strong enough not to be blinded by it. The car stopped in front of the building, and the driver silently opened the door. Graham stepped out first but did not go in. Claire followed, her heels tapping lightly on the stone pavement, though each step felt heavier. In the elevator, she did not look at him again, offered no good night, no final glance. When her door closed behind her, Claire leaned back against it, slipped off her shoes, and exhaled. The room was quiet, with no voices, no music, only the truth echoing inside her. Even if Graham had not changed, even if his eyes remained as gentle as the night she first saw him sitting in the kitchen, she herself was retreating, not because she did not trust him, but because she did not yet know how to trust herself in a world where a single look could make old wounds bleed all over again. Graham could not sleep. After Claire closed the door without a word, he stood in the living room for a long time, his hand still fastened on the button of his vest as though keeping his appearance neat could somehow keep the turmoil inside him from spilling over. Yet the silence in the apartment felt enormous. Not the familiar, luxurious quiet he was used to, but the absence of something that had become important. The next morning, when Claire did not appear in the kitchen, when there was no scent of coffee and no gentle footsteps, Graham knew he could not pretend any longer. He walked to her door and knocked 3 times. There was no answer. But the door was not locked. Claire was sitting at the edge of the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face bare of makeup, her eyes still and deep like a lake untouched by wind. She did not look up when he entered. Graham stood for a moment, then sat in the chair across from her, his hands clasped, his eyes lowered to the floor, and for the first time he was not the powerful Graham Beckett, not the man who controlled every variable, but someone struggling to find words he had spent his whole life avoiding. He told her he had never been someone who knew how to apologize at the right moment, but that morning he believed he needed to learn. Claire lifted her gaze, her expression free of accusation, only waiting. Graham told her he had been raised in a family where everything was defined by results, and there was no room for emotion, that when his mother died he had been 15, and his father had not shed a tear, but simply told him he had to be stronger from that moment on, and he had lived that way ever since, working, earning, becoming untouchable while forgetting how to feel anything real. Claire said nothing, and Graham drew a slow breath, his eyes never leaving her as he told her that when she stepped out of the car without looking at him the night before, he realized he had become so accustomed to not being hurt that he had forgotten what loss felt like, and he was afraid, not because of what others might say, but because he was afraid of losing her. Afraid she might believe those whispered judgments more than she believed the way he looked at her. Claire blinked softly, her voice barely more than a breath, as she admitted she did not want to believe them, but was not sure she was strong enough not to be shaken. Graham nodded and said he understood, because he too had once been shaken, that when real emotion arrives, it can make a person lose control, but not every loss of control is wrong. He drew a small object from his pocket and opened his hand to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, the inside engraved with tiny letters only visible up close. Claire leaned forward and read the words, "You are not invisible." Graham told her he had it made after the first morning they had shared breakfast, when he realized that for years he had not truly seen anyone, and she was the first person who made him want to look, want to understand, want to remember. Claire reached out with a trembling hand to touch the bracelet, then looked at him, her eyes shimmering as she asked why it had to be her. Graham straightened, his gaze deep and certain, as though the answer had always lived there, and told her it was because she was the only one who had never tried to change to fit into his world, but instead made him want to change that world to fit her. She reached out and placed her hand lightly over his, saying nothing, and for the first time since the gala, Graham felt his breath ease. They sat beside each other like that, with nothing left to hide, the confessions not weakening him but making him more real, and Claire understood that in a world full of walls and judgment, she had found the one place she could exist without shrinking, right here, in the quiet certainty of his presence. The next message arrived that afternoon, while Claire and Graham were preparing dinner together. Unlike the previous ones, it was not just a few threatening lines, it was a photograph. Claire standing outside the boutique on the day she tried on the dress, the black gown in her hands, her gaze drifting toward the street. The picture had been taken from a distance, but it was clear enough to recognize every feature. Graham stared at the screen, his expression shifting from shock to cold fury in less than a second. He called Marcus immediately, instructing him to pull footage from every camera around that neighborhood on that day, especially any vehicles that lingered suspiciously. Claire stood behind him, asking nothing. Not panicking, but her tightened grip on the edge of the counter betrayed her unease. An hour later, Marcus returned the call. In a closed meeting inside the penthouse, Marcus laid out a series of printed images from security cameras. A black SUV with no license plates had stopped a short distance from the boutique, its windows tinted, but in several frames the rear passenger lowered the window just enough to reveal part of a face. Graham did not need a second look. He knew exactly who it was. Owen Hartley, the man who had once been a partner, a friend, a part of the company Graham had built from the ground up, but also the man who had betrayed him by selling information to a rival and vanishing from the financial world just before he could be prosecuted. For years, no one knew where Owen had gone or how he survived. Graham had thought it ended when he refused a settlement, took the case to court, and severed every remaining tie. But Owen clearly did not think so. Claire sat quietly in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the photograph as if searching for something beyond the captured image. Graham approached and sat beside her, his voice lower as he explained that Owen had once been the person he trusted most, but greed had driven him to betrayal, and he had believed the man would disappear forever once the dust settled. Claire turned to him, her expression not fearful but sharply sober. She told him she was not the real target, only a tool meant to drag him out of his safe ground. Graham nodded, adding that Owen wanted him to choose, either withdraw from the upcoming merger investment or let her become the price he paid. Marcus interjected, saying they were increasing security around the building and that from that day forward Claire would have someone escorting her at all times, even inside the residence. Claire did not object. She did not want to be heroic. She only did not want Graham to carry the weight alone. That night, after Marcus and the security team left, Graham stood by the window, the city lights casting long streaks of brightness across his face. Claire approached quietly and stood beside him. He did not look at her, but his hand shifted just slightly, brushing hers, a silent acknowledgement that no matter how strong he seemed, he still needed someone to lean on. Claire asked if he regretted pulling her into his world. Graham shook his head, telling her he only regretted not realizing sooner that there were things worth fighting for beyond money or power. Claire tightened her fingers around his. She understood that from this moment forward nothing would be easy, but she also knew that if they moved forward together, no matter how the past returned or how the shadows threatened, neither of them would face it alone. And for the first time, Claire did not feel like someone standing at the edge of a life too large. She was at its very center, no longer invisible, no longer shrinking, but part of the battle and part of the heart of the man who had never imagined he would need someone this much. 3 days later, on a cold, gray afternoon typical of late November in Chicago, Graham walked into an old bar tucked along a narrow street in River North, where dim amber lights and the soft crackle of jazz drifting from an antique record player made time seem to slow. He arrived alone, with no bodyguards, no assistant, not even Marcus. Only a thin envelope in his hand and an unreadable chill in his eyes. Owen had been waiting in a corner booth, his ash-gray coat draped over the seat beside him, a glass of untouched scotch before him. He looked much the same as the last time Graham had seen him, still carrying that careless confidence, though his eyes had grown a bit more weathered and his smile noticeably more strained. He remarked that he was surprised Graham had agreed to meet alone, expecting him to send a lawyer or at least that cold-faced assistant. Graham did not answer. He opened the envelope, pulled out a stack of documents, and placed them on the table, explaining it was the withdrawal contract for the merger between Clarion Capital and Raintech, and that Owen needed to sign within 24 hours and end his pathetic game. Owen let out a quiet laugh, turning his glass slowly between his fingers, telling Graham he had not changed, still giving orders as if the world owed him something. Graham lifted his gaze, his voice low and cold, telling Owen he had aimed at the wrong target, that Claire was not a weakness, but she was the only reason Graham had not already ensured he lost his citizenship by morning. Graham reminded him he still held influence, and that the people Owen was using to intimidate him were being watched, and if he spoke a single word, they would vanish without trial, without headlines, simply gone. Owen shifted slightly, caution flickering in his eyes, and asked whether Graham truly thought he would abandon everything because of a few threats. Graham replied, "No. He would abandon it because he knew Graham could and would follow through, while Owen never would." Graham slid another photograph across the table, a picture of Owen shaking hands with a senior executive of an underground financial network flagged by the FBI. Graham said he had no intention of reporting him now, but if Claire was harmed even once more, he would not hesitate. Owen stared at the photo for several seconds before leaning back with a long, weary exhale. He asked what was so special about her that she could change Graham so profoundly. Graham remained silent for a long moment before answering quietly, but with absolute certainty, that she made him want to become the man his mother would be proud of. Nothing more complicated than that. Owen said nothing further. He picked up a pen, signed the contract, and slid it back toward Graham, telling him he would step away, but that this would be the last time Graham won. Graham took the papers and stood, his expression free of triumph or anger, telling Owen he did not need to win, he only needed her to be safe. When Graham left the bar, the cold outside felt sharper, but something in his chest eased. The negotiation had not been explosive. No guns, no chase. Only two men who had once shared a battlefield now standing on opposite sides of choices that had led them here. And Graham knew he had just placed a final end to the last threat stalking the life he was building with Claire. When he returned to the apartment, he found her asleep on the sofa, a book open and forgotten on her lap, the warm light casting a gentle calm across her face. He approached quietly, laid a blanket over her shoulders, then sat beside her just to sit, just to watch her breathe. And for the first time in many years, Graham did not think about tomorrow's plans or numbers or deals. He thought only about the woman resting beside him, and the fragile peace he finally understood was real. Claire woke beneath the warm golden light of the living room, realizing there was a soft blanket draped over her and the faint scent of chamomile tea lingering in the air. She pushed herself upright, her hair slightly tousled from the nap, her eyes still hazy as she noticed Graham sitting a few steps away, his back resting against the glass pane, a book in his hand that he seemed not to have read at all. He had been watching her, his gaze free of the habitual caution, the rigid lines of strain no longer carved into his forehead the way they were whenever work consumed him. What remained was a quiet tenderness. Claire pulled the blanket around her shoulders and inched closer. She asked where he had been all afternoon, her voice not accusatory, only gently opening a door. Graham closed the book and set it aside, his eyes never leaving hers as he told her he had gone to see Owen. Claire paused, then nodded slowly, asking if it was over, and he told her it was, that there would be no more messages, no more threats, that Owen had signed the withdrawal papers. that everything had been handled cleanly and no one had been harmed. Claire exhaled, her hand rising instinctively to her chest, as though checking whether her heart was still beating at a normal rhythm. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence settled between them like a space finally cleared for breath, for a fragile sense of safety long postponed. Claire looked at him, her eyes no longer carrying their familiar guarded glint, but instead holding a soft warmth. She moved closer, until there was nothing left to bridge. Then suddenly she wrapped her arms around him, not a polite gesture, not a fleeting impulse, but a full, earnest embrace from someone who had been left behind too many times, someone who had learned to shrink herself inside a vast world and had at last found a shoulder strong enough to rest on without fear of falling. Graham stilled for a moment, as if his body had not yet learned how to accept such closeness, but a breath later he lifted his arms and held her, gentle yet firm, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head as he felt the warmth of her tousled hair and the steady beat of her heart against his chest. Claire whispered that she never thought she would have a day like this, a day when she did not have to brace herself, when someone would walk toward her not out of pity, but because they truly wanted to be beside her. Graham did not answer right away. He tilted his head just enough to see her face and spoke softly, telling her he had not come to her to rescue her, but because she had awakened something in him, made him see himself clearly, made him recognize the hollow spaces he had tried to fill with work, with power, with a life that was not real. He told her she did not need to be strong every moment, because from now on she would not have to carry everything alone. Claire smiled, a weary but relieved smile, and rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes as she allowed her body, for the first time in years, to loosen completely in an embrace that asked nothing of her. Outside, the cold wind still swept through the city, lights still pulsed and traffic still surged. But inside the apartment, between two people who had once seemed to live on opposite ends of existence, something had shifted. Not loudly, not with declarations, only with an embrace, a quiet truth, and the end of fear opening the beginning of something entirely different. A new chapter not marked by running, but by staying, and by living fully in the gaze of someone she trusted. The next morning, Claire woke to a strange yet comforting scent drifting from the kitchen. She did not rush to rise, choosing instead to remain still as the early light slipped through the curtains and brushed softly across her face and the back of her hand. The room was the same as before, yet the air felt different, softened somehow, as though all the tension and fear had receded. When she stepped out, her hair tied high and a thin sweater draped loosely over her shoulders, she stopped short at the sight of Graham standing with his back to her in the kitchen, a ladle in hand, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to mid-arm, the warm smell of slightly crisped eggs and butter filling the space. He had not noticed her, muttering something under his breath as he worked, and Claire leaned gently against the doorway, watching him in that rare moment when the man who had once appeared cold and untouchable now stood tilted over a pan of eggs with an earnest awkwardness. When Graham turned and saw her, holding a plate in his hands, he froze for a moment before telling her he had expected her to sleep longer. She smiled and told him she had never expected to see him in the kitchen wearing an apron like that. He glanced at the gray apron tied crookedly at his waist and shrugged lightly, saying he thought he should try doing something different for once. Claire looked at the plate he had prepared, fried eggs with the edges a bit burnt, a few slices of toasted bread and 2 halved tomatoes sprinkled with oregano. Imperfect, but real. She took a seat while Graham placed the plate before her and poured 2 glasses of orange juice with a care that made her want to laugh. They ate in a warm silence that required no decoration. Afterward, Graham remained at the table, his elbows resting lightly on the surface as his fingers turned the empty glass. Claire dabbed her lips with a napkin and was about to rise to clear the dishes when he spoke. without warning and without hesitation. He said he thought he was in love with her. Claire stopped mid-motion, looked up, and met his gaze. He was looking straight at her, not avoiding, not flustered, simply stating a truth he could no longer keep inside. Graham straightened, no longer fidgeting with the glass, and said he knew he was not good at showing feelings, but from the moment she had walked away from the gala with those sad eyes he had started to feel afraid, and when the threat disappeared, the only thing he feared losing was her. Claire stayed silent for a few seconds, studying him as if measuring whether her heart could resume beating after hearing those words. Then she smiled, a smile free of caution or shyness, a smile warm and bright as first morning light. She told him she once believed love was something reserved for perfect things, for girls who fit the mold and stories without scars, and she had been wrong because he had just made her the worst breakfast she had ever eaten. Yet it was the breakfast that made her want to stay. Graham let out a soft laugh, his first in days. She stood and walked around the table to sit beside him, leaning gently into his shoulder. She said that if this was his way of confessing, then she feared she had accepted long ago, the moment he sat across from her at the table with that unexpectedly gentle look in his eyes. Graham turned to her, his gaze softening as his hand settled over hers, saying he could learn to cook if she taught him. Claire nodded and whispered that she only asked that he not give up halfway. The kitchen was no longer merely a place for preparing meals. It had become the space where two people, carrying pieces that once seemed incompatible, were slowly fitting themselves together through tenderness, honesty, and the small, awkward truths they had never dared reveal before. In the pale gold light slipping through the window, Claire understood that this morning was not simply the start of a new day, but the beginning of a new life, born from the quiet, precious things she had once believed she would never have. 3 weeks after the morning when Graham confessed his feelings over the breakfast he had prepared for her, the kitchen in the penthouse was no longer the cold, untouched space it used to be. The spice jars were now neatly arranged on the wooden rack Claire had asked to install. The kitchen towels with tiny, cheerful patterns changed each week, and the refrigerator door held a few handwritten notes in her tilted script. Each morning, Graham tried to wake earlier, not for work, but simply to see Claire in her oversized sweater, her loosely tied hair, and the soft haze still lingering in her eyes. They lived more slowly, more gently, yet their love did not lose a single beat. Graham learned to cook in earnest. He read recipes, tasted and retasted, cut his fingers twice, burned the toast 3 times, but he kept going, and Claire stayed beside him through every mishap, laughing as she helped him wash the towers of pans and bowls left behind after each culinary experiment. And on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as the city outside shifted slowly toward winter, Graham decided to make the first pasta dish Claire had ever cooked for him. He said he wanted to revisit a memory. Claire suspected nothing, even helping him chop onions and open the jar of tomatoes, though he insisted on seasoning it himself. When she stepped out onto the balcony to take a call from her sister, Graham took the chance to finish the last part of the plan he had been preparing for almost 2 weeks. A small navy velvet box was tucked deep inside the jar of oregano leaves, the same herb she had used the first night she cooked for him, the night that had changed the direction of his life. After dinner, while they were sipping their wine, and Graham rose to fetch more bread, he casually remarked that he thought she had forgotten the oregano. Claire frowned, insisting she had added it before the sauce went into the pan. He placed the spice jar on the table and told her to check again. She laughed as she opened it, but the laughter dissolved the moment she saw what lay hidden beneath the dried leaves. 1 second, then 2, then 3. Her hand trembled as she lifted the small box, looking at Graham as though she could not trust her own eyes. He was already kneeling, his deep blue eyes holding a solemnity rarely seen in their quiet evenings. He told her he once believed his life needed nothing more, but then she came, with her gentleness and her quiet laughter and those dinners scented with oregano, and a love that did not need to be spoken aloud, and he realized the only thing missing was waking up each morning knowing she was his home forever. He asked her if she would marry him. A tear slid down her cheek before she even felt it. Her heart seemed to stop for a few beats, then rush forward so fast it made her chest ache. She could not speak, and simply nodded, then threw her arms around him, the box still clutched in her hand, the ring falling to the wooden floor unnoticed by them both. They laughed through her tears while Claire scolded him for hiding the ring in the thing I use most in the kitchen, and Graham answered that he wanted her to find it the way she had made him find love, tucked inside the simplest, most ordinary things. That night, with the kitchen lights still glowing, 2 half-finished glasses of wine on the counter, and the ring finally resting on Claire's finger, they sat together for a long, quiet while. No more words were needed because everything had already been spoken in that nod. A promise. A home. A life born from a single meal and continuing into days where neither of them would ever again have to live in silence or fear. Claire sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, her hand still wrapped tightly around Graham's as if letting go might cause the moment to dissolve like a beautiful dream. The ring rested perfectly on her 4th finger, fitting so naturally it felt as though it had been measured by fate itself. The warm, golden light overhead fell softly across their faces, illuminating the hesitant happiness that lingered in their eyes. Graham sat beside her, quietly studying the hand that now held his future, then lifting his gaze to her with the careful reverence of someone touching something more precious than anything he had ever owned. Claire turned the ring gently, still unable to believe it was real, then looked at him with a small smile breaking through the tears that had not yet fully dried. She asked if he was certain, reminding him she was a tangled mess of a woman who had never imagined a wedding dress or dreamed of a ceremony filled with bells and flowers. Someone nothing like the women who had once passed through his life. Graham gathered both her hands in his, holding them firmly between his palms, his slate blue eyes softened with a tenderness rarely seen. He told her that precisely because she was unlike anyone else, she was the person he wanted beside him for the rest of his life, that she made him feel like a real man, not a polished echo of a busy businessman or someone who lived by calculations alone. With her, he was allowed to be wrong, to hesitate, to be vulnerable, and he loved every part of that. Claire smiled, this time without tears, and teased him gently by asking if he had just said the word, love. Graham nodded without blinking and told her he loved her, not because she cooked well or made him laugh, but because she made him want to become a better version of himself every single day. She did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, memorizing him as if carving the image into her own heart. Then she leaned closer, so close their breaths mingled, and whispered a confession soft as a prayer. She told him she loved him too, that she loved the way he quietly sat to eat with her that first night, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person alive in that once cold penthouse, the way he fumbled around the kitchen, and even the way he hid a ring inside an old spice jar. She loved the silences between them because in those silences she felt safe. Graham froze for a heartbeat, almost disbelieving what he had heard, then smiled, the rare smile of a man who had lived many years without knowing what complete happiness felt like. He brushed his fingers across her cheek where the tears had dried and pressed a gentle kiss there, a kiss that felt like the closing of all the quiet, uncertain days and the beginning of something new. They stayed like that for a long time, without plans for the future, without witnesses or vows, needing only each other, here and now. And if anyone were to ask Claire when she first truly believed she was loved, It would be this moment when Graham did not make grand promises or offer elaborate declarations, but simply sat with her on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the faint scent of oregano, two hands clasped tightly, and a heart that had finally found its home. No doubts, no hiding, only love, simple and profound, spoken through honest words and a gaze that never lied. One yes, one I love you, and a beginning that needed no ceremony, only two people brave enough to trust in each other. On the first morning after the grand opening of their new restaurant, Chicago still lingered in a light, sleepy haze beneath a thin veil of mist that clung to its streets. A gentle breeze carried the smell of freshly roasted coffee from the shop across the road, mingling with the warm scent of toasted bread drifting from the kitchen behind the glass storefront. The wooden sign hanging by the window frame bore the handwritten name, Claire's Table, its soft, curling strokes as simple and graceful as the woman behind it. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been the night before when the two of them stayed late, wiping every tabletop spotless, checking each cup and dish, and placing the spice jars Claire had brought with her from the penthouse kitchen where it had all begun. Graham stood behind the coffee counter, his shirt sleeves neatly rolled up, the first rays of morning slipping through the glass and catching in his dark brown hair where a few strands of silver glimmered faintly. He was no longer the Graham Beckett of financial headlines or boardrooms filled with people awaiting his decisions. He was a man carefully adjusting the milk in a cappuccino for the first customer of the day. Lifting his eyes now and then toward the small table near the window where Claire sat with her notebook, her hands still dusted with flour and her hair tied up with an old wooden clip, she smiled at him, offering a small distant nod that held more gratitude than 1,000 words for believing in a dream she once thought out of reach. Claire's Table was not a glamorous restaurant. It was a small eatery with raw brick walls and gentle golden lights like the glow of a late afternoon, a place where guests were called by name, where dishes were seasoned with her grandmother's recipes, and where each spice jar carried a tiny handwritten story on its label. One regular customer once said that eating there felt like having dinner in a relative's kitchen after a long, tiring day. Claire had laughed at that, then turned away to hide the sudden shine in her eyes. She had never imagined a day would come when her dream would not only become real, but begin again from the very place where her deepest wounds once lived. On the day of the opening, there was no grand party and no reporters, only close friends, a few old neighbors, and a handful of early customers who had once worked under Graham and now came out of curiosity. Claire stood in the open kitchen with a wooden spoon in hand, nerves fluttering in her eyes, while Graham stood beside her wearing an apron, his hand resting gently on her back as a quiet reminder that she was not alone. That night, after the cleaning was done, Claire sat by herself in the lingering scent of baked bread, the chandelier casting soft, shimmering shadows across the tiled floor. Graham approached with a glass of water and sat beside her, asking what she thought. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder and exhaled softly, saying that even if everything ended right there, she would still feel it was enough. Graham squeezed her hand gently and told her in a low voice that it would not end, that this was only the beginning. And the next morning, when Claire unlocked the glass door to welcome the first touch of sunlight, she noticed a small slip of paper taped to the spice jar by the stove, written in Graham's handwriting, brief yet enough to make her heart skip. It read, "Every day we spend here, I will love you a little more." Claire smiled, pressing her fingers gently against the words, and understood that sometimes the greatest things in life do not come from perfect plans, but begin with a simple meal, a kitchen filled with light, and a person who chooses to stay. One weekend evening, after the restaurant had closed following a busy day, Claire sat alone at the small table near the window where she could see the blurred glow of streetlights drifting through Chicago's thin night fog. Beside her was a cup of hot tea, and the hand-embroidered tablecloth Graham's mother had sent from Virginia, small and delicate, yet full of warmth. She often sat here at the end of each day, a habit that formed naturally ever since the restaurant opened. Graham was in the kitchen washing the last of the glasses, glancing up now and then through the glass partition to be sure she was still there. He was no longer the man who lived only to control and build a financial empire, but a husband who slightly over-toasted the bread, yet never forgot that Claire preferred unsweetened mint tea. When the front door chimed shut for the final time that night, he came out without saying a word, simply resting his hand on her shoulder, gentle and steady enough for her to feel his presence. Claire looked up and smiled softly. She looked at him and remembered everything they had endured, from the first evening with flour on her cheek to the ring hidden in a spice jar, from the fear of a woman who once believed she did not deserve love to the present moment where she was loved every day, quietly yet completely. Graham sat across from her, met her gaze, and whispered, like a promise he would keep repeating without needing a reason or a special occasion, that she would never again be invisible. Claire did not answer. She only held his hand and nodded in silence, because sometimes the truest expressions of love do not need more words, only the courage to live them day after day. Their story was not a fairy tale. It was the story of two people marked by old wounds, long accustomed to silence and self-protection, who found each other and chose to heal side by side through the simplest acts of tenderness. It was a reminder that real love does not spring from perfection, but from presence, and that every one of us, no matter our scars or how often we have been made to feel unworthy, can be seen, chosen, and loved wholly. If you have stayed with us until this moment, thank you deeply for joining us on this emotional journey. Did this story touch you? Did it remind you of someone who once walked through your life quietly? We would truly love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and tell us what you felt, what you understood from this story, and whether you believe in a kind of love that does not need to be loud to change an entire life. Do not forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with anyone you think might need something gentle to listen to in the midst of their busy days. We will continue bringing heartfelt stories filled with depth and humanity each day so you can listen, feel, and perhaps find a part of yourself in each character. Thank you for staying, for listening with your whole heart. We wish you good health and a life filled with ease and quiet joy. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.